We continue to examine the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. We're picking up where we left off after examining Abraham last week. The next several people of faith we find are either already dead or at the point of death. In the face of death, we see their faith shine. And we begin, as we continue past Abraham, to notice the faith of Sarah. We read in Scripture that Sarah bore. In Hebrews 11 and verse 11, we read, "By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age." Now, consider Abraham's response when he was told about Sarah bearing a child. Well, we talked about the faith of Abraham last week, so let's look at the conversation between him and God about his wife, Sarah. We have to go back to Genesis chapter 17 to find this conversation. And there in Genesis 17 and verse 16, God told Abraham about Sarah. "And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her." Now, how did this great man of faith respond? Well, verse 7 says, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed." Why? Well, as he asked, "Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Now think about a woman being 90 years old bearing a child. That's why when we look in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 4, there in verse 19, Paul referred to the deadness of Sarah's womb. As Genesis referred to in Genesis 18 verse 11, she had passed the age of childbearing. For all practical purposes, when it came to bearing children, Sarah was dead. But this is why Abraham laughed and why Sarah herself laughed at the thought of having a child. Even she herself in Genesis 18 verses 12 and 13 thought, "Shall I surely bear a child since I am old?" I mean, again, it's just unheard of for someone that old to bear a child. But then we see in chapter 20 of Genesis God's faithfulness. God told him that it would happen, and we come to chapter 20 and we see it happened exactly as God said it would. Because in Genesis 20 verses 1 and 2, we read, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him." You see how over and over it emphasized that God did exactly what God said he was going to do? As difficult as it was to believe, God can always be trusted. God is faithful, and we can put our faith in him. So I ask you, do you have the faith that Sarah did? The faith that allowed her to see her child born? Because that's what we see it took. We continue in Hebrews 11, and we see by faith, because the child was born to her, because she judged him faithful who has promised. What God promised he would do was so incredible it was laughable. But she believed if God promised it, he would do it. And he did. And so that's why we ask, how great is your faith in the amazing promises of God? Do you have the faith to judge him faithful, as Sarah did? Well, we also look at others who were basically dead in Hebrews 11. And we see there also, by faith, Isaac blessed. In Hebrews 11, we drop down a few verses now to verse 20, and we read there, "By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come." Now, we find the occasion of Isaac blessing his sons in Genesis 27. We read there in verse 1, "Isaac was old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see." And as he said himself in verse 2, "Behold, now I'm old, I do not know the day of my death." He seems to basically be implying that it could be any time. He didn't know exactly when, but it was imminent. And as we see Esau stated a few verses later in verse 41 about Isaac, he said, "The days of mourning for my father are at hand." Isaac was indeed at the point of death when he gave this blessing to his sons. Now, we could talk about the deception that took place with the blessing, but our text for today focuses on the nature of the blessing. In verse 28, we find that one of the first things Isaac told Jacob was therefore, may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. And as we continue to follow Jacob, we see that it's exactly what happened. We come now to the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 33, before Jacob's family entered Canaan, some of the final words here of Moses. As verse 1 said, now this is the blessing which Moses, the man of God, blessed the sons of Israel before his death. And we drop down through these blessings down to verse 28, which reads, so Israel lived in safety, Jacob lived alone, in a land of grain and wine, whose heavens dropped down dew. Exactly what Isaac had said so many years ago was going to happen for the family of his son Jacob. And we get back to Genesis chapter 28 or 27, and we see as Isaac turned his attention to Esau. In verse 40, he told Esau, by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. Now Esau was the oldest, but he was going to serve the young, or he was the older, and he was going to serve the younger. And we see this is exactly what happened. The kings of Israel, that being Jacob, repeatedly defeated the Edomites, which were the descendants of Esau. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 47, we read there where King Saul defeated them. And then later in 2 Samuel chapter 8, in verse 14, we read of King David. And he also put garrisons in Edom throughout all Edom, and he put garrisons. All the Edomites became David's servants. Through faith, on his deathbed, Isaac told his sons what the future held for them and their descendants. Now, with his partiality for Esau, it was not the future he would have chosen, but through faith in God's providence, he accepted it and stated it as so. So, do you have the faith to accept God's will for the future, even when it may not be in line with yours? You will if you have the faith of Isaac. And after Isaac, we return again to Hebrews 11, and we see by faith Jacob, blessed and worshipped. And we find first of all in verse 21, the first part of the verse says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Now, the blessing took place in Genesis chapter 48. In verse 1, we see where Joseph took his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, with him to see Jacob. And in verse 5, Jacob claimed both of them as his own sons. We drop down to verse 16, and he said, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named among them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now, in verses 17 through 19, we see that when Joseph saw Jacob put his right hand on Ephraim, the younger, he tried to swap them. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. Well, this is exactly what we see when we continue to follow the history of the Israelites. When we see the numbering of the tribes in the book of Numbers, guess which tribe was larger? That's right. Ephraim is indeed greater in number, just as Jacob had said many years ago would happen. And then we also see here in Hebrews 11 about Jacob. By faith, Jacob worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. Now, the worship probably refers to what took place in chapter 47. In verses 29 and 30, he told Joseph, please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And in verse 41, after Joseph swore to Jacob that he would, he bowed himself on the head of the bed. Now, why was this so important to Jacob? Well, we come into chapter 48 again, in verse 21, it's because of his faith in what the future held. He said there in chapter 48, verse 21, behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. While at the point of death, by faith he looked forward to the promise God had made to him and his fathers. So we continue a little further forward, and we come to Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob. And we read again in Hebrews 11, this time verse 22, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. You see, Joseph believed his father's words. He had faith in them. We go to Genesis chapter 50, and we find where Joseph states his faith that we find here in Hebrews. We read there in Genesis 50, verses 24 and 25, Joseph said to his brothers, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Well, we go on further into the book of Exodus, and in Exodus 13, as the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, you know what we read. Verse 19 of Exodus 13, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. And we continue to read through the history of the Israelites, and we come to Joshua 24. And there in verse 32, we see where Joseph's bones were buried in the land of promise. Once again, God always fulfills his promise, and you can put your faith in this fact. When each of us comes to the point of death, may we be like this family of faith, having the faith of Sarah, her son Isaac, his son Jacob, and his son Joseph.